themes and some of its ideas. So, Joshua, welcome. Glad that you're with us. Um, I understand you're speaking to us from Tel Aviv, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Excellent. So that itself is a marker of some of the themes of the book. The book, for those of you who don't yet have your copy, is Tablets Shattered. And it's a book about the end of the American Jewish century and the future of Jewish life, written by someone who has lived much of what he writes about, giving it, I think, greater depth and credence. So perhaps what we can do to get everyone on the page together, Joshua, is if you would just start by telling us what inspired you to write the book, and what do you see as its main arguments, its main contribution?
Sure. Um, the book started with a much more, I would say, a much more modest and almost like a much narrower interest in the sense that um, the initial idea was that my sense was that a lot had changed in American Jewish life over the first Trump presidency. Um, in terms of different kinds of approach to ritual, the way the Jewish communities were understanding themselves in relationship to the United States and in relationship to Israel, and so that was the initial germ of the book. And when I sent the first proposal to my editor, she said, this is nice, but it's missing the searching quality that a lot of people might be looking for in a book about American Jewish life. It's missing the personal quest for meaning. It's missing the questions about community. And so I revamped it and sent the proposal in. I mean, another thing about this book is that its life has really been bookended, no pun intended, by um, the wars in Israel Palestine. So I sent the proposal in Purim of 2021, and it was after that summer's war that the publisher said, you know what, we want this book. We think this is the time for it. And the manuscript was due basically a week before October 7th. And when that happened, at first I looked at my editor and I said, why don't we just put an editor's note and publish it anyway? And she had the fantastic wisdom to say, I think there's an opportunity here to actually process in real time, in a way, what a lot of people are experiencing. And so I ended up rewriting a large section of the book, something like close to 20,000 words of the initial manuscript after um, October 7th. But so that's kind of the intro to its conditions of production. But um, the larger argument ended up being about the collapse of what I call the American Jewish consensus, which took shape roughly in the post-war years and then lasted basically up into our own day. It's the book also in some ways, well, in a lot of ways, is also about my own family's story, which as I went about writing the book, I realized mirrored in some uncanny ways certain stations on the in the transformations of American Jewish life. And writing through the experience of my family was one way of adding um, a more personal touch to the book. Like it would have been a little bit less interesting, I think, if it was just had been just dry history. So in that way, nonfiction written for a mass audience is a kind of formalistically conservative genre because you need narrative, you need character, you need to draw people in. It can't just be a dry history. Or on the flip side, it can't just be, sermonizing. there has to be narrative. So that's a little bit about as an introduction.
Great, thank you. So let's build on that. What was or is the American Jewish century? What does that mean?
So as I saw it, much of what we think of as American Jewish culture took shape in the 100 years since 1924, which is when America basically closed its doors to to Jewish immigration. From 1880 to 1924, the vast majority of American Jews' forebearers came to America, something around 2 million Jews from East and Central Europe. There were Jews, of course, in America beforehand, but very few. I mean, there was an earlier wave of immigration in the 1840s, mainly German Jews, but the American Jewish life was not, there were not a lot of American Jews before 1880. And um, and so this isn't just like an argument about the century. What happens during the century is also important. And during that 100-year period between 1924 and 2024, the argument in the book is that an ideological consensus based on three pillars took shape. Now, they really crystallized after World War II and Israel's creation, but some of the pillars were in formation even before then. And in the book, so these three pillars are what I refer to as Americanism, Zionism, and liberalism. And then just to break it down a little bit more, by Americanism, I mean a certain kind of American Jewish exceptionalism. It's the belief held by a lot of American Jews that the United States is an exceptionally good country and that its exceptional goodness is confirmed by the experience of Jews here. And that starts very early, actually, in the 20th century, where American Jews begin to write about the concordance of Americanism and Judaism, as the Rabbi Kaufman Kohler put it in one of his essays. And then, of course, during World War II and after Israel's founding, that America also comes to represent the defender of Jewish interests on the global stage, both through its eventual support for Israel, but also its Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union, which becomes important in the construction of post-war American Jewish identity. The pillar of Zionism isn't this thing that everyone's debating about right now, one state, two states. What I mean by Zionism in the book is really the idea that the United States, that Israel is a moral exemplar, that it encapsulates American Jewish values in miniature, and that it's also the culmination of all of Jewish history. Basically, the idea that the Torah is culmination in some sense. Its telos is in the creation of the state of Israel. So that's and I think that view is also held by a fair number of American Jews and become more so after Israel's founding, of course, and specifically after 1967, 1973. And then the third pillar, liberalism. What I mean in the book is actually not political liberalism, but religious liberalism. And as I see it, religious liberalism is defined by kind of three subcomponents. One is that the unit of religious participation is the individual rather than, say, the community. The way into religious practice is voluntarist. It's based around choice rather than, say, the more traditional concept or halachic concept of mitzvah, of commandment. And that as a corollary to these things, liberal religion is also by nature pluralist. But my argument in the book is that liberal pluralism became a certain kind of relativism also, and then it became very hard for American Jews, one, to give reasons to say their children about why it might be worth living a Jewish life as opposed to other lifestyle alternatives on the marketplace of experience in the United States. And it comes from a good thing. Like our non-judgmentalness and pluralism is one of the accomplishments of American Jewish life. The idea like no one not telling someone the right way or the wrong way. But if you can't say what's right and wrong, then it becomes very hard to perpetuate the communal practice. And so my argument is that those three pillars, which really crystallized after 1945, 1948, by 2024 had begun to collapse, and that their collapse was one of the reasons for a lot of the confusion, polarization, acrimony that we see in American Jewish life today.
That's great. Thank you. And it was both clear in your book and in this presentation. So thank you for that kind of clarity. And I want to muddy the waters a bit if I could.
Of
Uh,
course.
I have one of the founding fathers of the American Jewish University, Rabbi David Lieber, who was really a tzaddik, a saint within the conservative world, and a great man. Once said to me that ideology is mostly temperament. And I hated it when he said it at the time because I was a young rabbi, which is to say, I thought I was right. And and over the years, the force of his comment has just grown with me. So if I could be so bold, reading your life history, you've always been a person of fairly strong opinion, and you gravitate to what some of us would think of as more extreme places, meaning no one could fairly call you a centrist. Um, and I think that's not a judgment. That's just I think.
No, I think that's probably true.
Yeah. So somewhere down the road, I'm going to ask you what strong opinions you repent of, but not now. Now, what I want to do is notice that you are drawn to clarity and sharp divides. You're either A or B. You're either dominant or you've collapsed. And um, I have many flaws, but I am the team player guy, and I like belonging, and I like being part of something bigger. And um,
I like that too, as you know from the book. Also,
oh,
I don't think
I
that
think you
they're
are you
contradictory there.
no like many of us, you are more complicated than your ideology. Um, but I do want to say that your ideology leads you to make comments like what you just made. It's collapsed. Um, and I want to point out, in fairness to those of us at the center, um, that the largest gatherings of American Jews for the last 5 years have all been from that central place. And it's the Jewish National Fund or Hillel or recently APAC, J Street. Those are the places that Jews congregate. And, the demise of the synagogue has been grossly exaggerated. It is certainly a recalibration from my perspective, but every Shabbat, hundreds of thousands of Jews gather, most of them liberal Jews. So, proportionally, it's true the Orthodox get a higher turnout. I'll give you that. But numerically, that old consensus is for many, many Jews alive and well. American Jews voted for the Democratic candidate in equally high numbers that they did in 2016, which is as high as they did prior to that. There has been among many Jews a strengthening of right-wing conviction, but on the whole, that late the constant, every 4 years, we get the prediction that finally the American Jews are going to turn Republican, and they've kicked the can down the road yet again. So
Yeah, I don't think that'll ever happen, for the record.
I don't either. So what I want to ask you, there was a question in all of that. Um, why the lurching? Why does it have to be it? I mean, look, I think partly it has to be because you like narrative. You've already told us you like narrative, and narrative is another way of saying you have to create a storyline, and the storyline forces you to marginalize events or people not on the storyline. But I want to pose that to you. My guess is most of the places you've been speaking about your book about are from the very consensus that you argue is over.
Right. Well, I think that if I had to be clearer, I would say that I'm not saying that there aren't still people who will believe in the consensus and in the ideals and then the pillars of the consensus. I think, I write this in the conclusion that what I think actually this is a sort of frustrating misunderstanding that many people have had about the book, that I'm saying it's going to disappear this form of Jewish practice. I don't think it's going to disappear, but I think it's indisputable that it is not setting the tone widely for the majority of American Jews. I also think that the institutional story here is important in terms of thinking about how do American Jews engage with organizations that are in some sense representing them. And I think that to the extent that American Jewish life will always mirror the general political climate of the United States, the crisis of representation in American life, to that. Even in the 90s, the journalist J.J. Goldberg wrote this book called Jewish Power. And I always love this quote where he says, the vast majority of American Jews could not name the organizations that speak in their name or the people doing communal business. And that was true in the 90s. I think it's probably even more true. But I also think that like my argument about the politics wasn't at all that American Jews were moving to the right. In fact, I critique the kind of the expectation among people like Norman Podhoretz and the neoconservatives, Milton Himmelfarb, all these people who were always kind of hoping that there would be a mass conversion of American Jews to right-wing politics, and there hasn't been. But I don't think that actually has very much to do with American Jews' Judaism as much as it has to do with other features of American Jewish sociology, say like educational attainment. I mean, that isn't to say there also is a residual liberal commitment in politics that American Jews have. And then the third, like the last thing I'll say to answer your question is that, and I have grown, and then we can get into this. Like I have come to appreciate more elements of the centrist life that I maybe had taken for granted or had critiqued in the book. But I think that to the extent that the book is a critique of this consensus as well as an analysis of its collapse, it has to do with what the consensus did to American Jewish life. And so when I talk about the pillar of Zionism, I'm not just saying, oh, everyone used to agree around Israel and now Israel's a source of division. It also happens to be the case that, this is something that I write in one of the chapters, that the transformation of American Judaism to center on Israel also meant that it in some ways threw out or enabled American Jewish communities to ignore really important questions about religious practice, ritual, the meaning, like what it means to live a Jewish life, because they could outsource that to kind of donating to AIPAC or the JNF. I mean, Irving Howe, who I quote in the book, the great socialist literary critic and author of World of Our Fathers, has this line in that book where he says that Israel and Zionism enabled American Jews to postpone that inner reconsideration of their Jewishness, which the American condition required. And so part of what the book is about is, well, Israel-centric American Judaism worked as long as the consensus was basically passable at the widest sense of the word. But when it became more contested, it wasn't like there were a lot of other things that were there in order to pick up the people who had fallen out of the consensus. And so I always, and I'm going to like one of the other questions, and you'll see where this is related, that I've gotten over the book is, why don't you write about modern Orthodoxy? Like it seems like a huge gap in the book that's about, that has a whole chapter on separatist Orthodoxy and Haredi life. Where's modern Orthodoxy in this story? And the reason why modern Orthodoxy isn't in the story is actually because they're one of the examples of a place where the consensus in terms of these pillars is actually strong. It's just a minority experience for American Jews of communities that are built around a kind of staunch patriotism, around staunch pro-Israelism, and around a certain kind of cautiously liberal like engagement with American politics. I mean, that's close to the community that I grew up in on the like more observant side of conservative Judaism and the Schechter community. But I don't, I don't think that experience is representative of the majority of people who understand themselves as Jews in the United States anymore.
Great. So let's dive into that because I know we haven't yet gotten to what the prescription is, but we'll save that for a bit because there's so much rich material here. Um, I I don't see myself in your description. And I have had a fairly, in my adult life, I got turned on to God and Torah at Hillel, and I worked for American politicians for a while, and then I went to rabbinical school at JTS in New York. So I'm a conservative product as an adult, always fairly idiosyncratic, but nonetheless. And I've been running a conservative rabbinical school, the Ziegler School, for 25 years. Um, you know, and so partly what I don't see myself in um, is the way you frame Americanism, Zionism, and liberalism are such maximal descriptions that they also flatten out the nuance that I think is there, right? So I have made a choice to live my life here. I mean, the irony is we are going to get to the paradox of the book and its ending seem to be not written by the same person. Someday there'll be a source critical edition of this book, and they will demonstrate that the chapter on Aliyah and everything was written by some other Joshua Leifer two, and not Joshua Leifer one, who's living in Florida somewhere. Um, Zionism for me is not neither more nor less than the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination in their homeland. And there can be good and bad Zionisms. There can, there are many things in American politics that I think are sinful and erroneous. Um, Part of Jewish normalcy is we get to be just as awful as the rest of humanity, and we also get to make advances. And what I would claim, just because I know you have a response already, I can see it. Um, if that's what Zionism is, then for me, the operative question is it worth fighting for and fighting for a good Zionism, a Zionism that's democratic and pluralistic and one that advances security and self development for all the peoples in the region, including Palestinians? Um, is that a Zionist vision worth holding on to? And let me just say one other thing and then I'll stop because I know I've said a lot. If by Zionism you mean a modern political movement, and that's a fair thing to put out there, um, then it's true. There have been plenty of Jews who haven't advocated for Jewish National Fund and, draining the swamps. That's a modern thing. But if what you mean by Zionism is that the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the eventual return of the Jews to Israel is anything other than at the core of Jewish religious belief, there's take a look in your traditional Koran Siddur, or Chabad Siddur, if you would ever want to use. I mean, the yearning for the return to Zion and the establishment of Jewish autonomy there is not a paste on addition. Many of the mitzvot, many of the commandments, um, kick into gear when the Jewish people return finally as a majority to their land. So talk about that because I felt like the Zionism you were setting up was not the Zionism of myself or most of the Zionists I know.
I mean, there's a lot to say. There. The first thing I'll say is like I'm talking to you from Tel Aviv, and so obviously I hope that you are. I'm invested in the answer to your question being, is it possible for collective Jewish self-determination to be just? I'm invested in that answer to that question being yes, quite strongly. To the extent that the book is critical of the expressions of American Jewish Zionism, it's that, at least as I experienced institutional and organized life, whether it was in the community I grew up or in the Hillel that I passed through at the university, the answer was actually no. That that you know that there was an equation of supporting the occupation and territorial maximalism and anti-democratic politics with Zionism, such that when I, as a young person, would come to the Jewish people in the Jewish community that I grew up in and say, how can you support Israel when it's doing these things? They seem wrong. The accusation against me, and this is true, I think, of a segment of people who grew up in kind of mainline American Jewish communities and then found their way in other places. The answer was, "You're an anti-Zionist. You're an anti-Semite." And I think that the organized Jewish community has a part in the blame for the practical disappearance of forms of progressive Zionism from American life, because people who came with critiques of what Israel was doing were basically shown the door. I mean, I don't think there's any. You mentioned J Street, but like the prime event in J Street's political life was in some ways its exclusion from the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. The leaders of American Jewish life, to a large extent, as I understood them, and this is the critique that the book puts forward, um, made a fairly concerted effort to exclude even people who were Zionists but who disagreed with them on things from the communal tent. And so that's one part of that's one narrative that the book is trying to tell. How did we get to where we are? It's because, in large part, of the narrowing of space for different forms of Zionism, such that people who maybe would have been able to hold a banner of progressive Zionism found themselves outside of the communal tent. Now, I do have a theological qualm with your description of the relationship between, the traditional sources and say the contemporary Jewish state. It's certainly true that Jewish communities over the millennia have dreamed of a return to Eretz Israel. But it was only relatively recently that people thought that that was something that could be carried out by human initiative and not by the coming of the Messiah. In fact, exile is divine punishment, like like we are in exile outside of the land because of our sins. The traditional Haredi or Orthodox opposition to Zionism as an ideology has to do with the human initiative violating a situation, a state of being that's been divinely ordained. So I think that there's a chilukei deot here about what exactly the sources say about national self-determination. Certainly, the land is important. The land is important, and there are certainly mitzvot that are specific to the land. But whether that means like I just think this is important because it's one of the conflations that I think has become a problem for American Jewish life, is that the nation state is a political form that was foreign to Jewish tradition until it became a political form in the world as such, in like the 19th century. And so it's not true, it's not accurate to project the Jewish sovereignty in a modern form onto a tradition that didn't know what that was.
Okay, I have one more thing to say about that, and then I have um, your Hebrew is beautiful, Yashakala. Some of our listeners don't know what chilukei deot means, which
So
is
a difference of opinion.
So either you say it in English as well as Hebrew, or I'm going
Okay,
to
I'll try.
try to offer a glossary because your ideas are too important to get lost.
Okay.
Obviously, I agree that contemporary political expression is the modern implementation, but it's the implementation of values that cut to the core of Judaism. The fact that there was no anesthesia in most of Jewish history doesn't mean it's a break from Judaism. Judaism provides for advancing medical insight, just as I would argue. And look, I'm not Orthodox, so I believe that Jewish law evolves. That's kind of built into my DNA, right? Um, but but the idea that the way we deliver on that ancient promise is through a 21st century set of political ideas That makes perfect sense for how God works in the world. Can I shift to a different part of the topic I'd like to,
Sure,
because I do want to leave room for you to tell us the solution too. I hope this is okay.
sure, of course.
Okay. Um, I don't recognize your Americanism or your liberalism, and I am a patriot. You can see the flags that are up in my study. Um, I have very strong ideas about what those flags represent. They're not in favor in wide swaths of either of my countries, but I nonetheless claim ownership of the flag. For me, if I could just put this up for purposes of you can shatter it again. You like shatter tablets, you can shatter this one. Um, there is much in America's past that is sinful and that is not simply a matter of our past. It's a legacy that continues to operate in the present, and we do need to be strongly critical of it, and we need to work on it. But where I am in the mainstream of American political thought is the conviction that this is a country that has created the mechanisms for expanding freedom, and that in each generation it does so without a bloody revolution. And that it's you don't have to be very good to be better than most of the countries of the world. You just have to provide for dynamic change without killing everybody. And this country has done that, and it's not just the Jews that it has been very good to. And it hasn't done so out of charity. And there are a lot of Americans who don't understand that and who resist it with every fiber in their being. We are now in a fight over the nature of democracy in this country, just as y'all are there. Um, but I still want to hold out that the promise of American freedom and American liberalism, and I don't mean by that Democrat versus Republican, I mean classical liberalism, um, is a communitarian individualism. I think that people get on their high horse and they pretend like it's one or the other. I don't see my fellow countrymen simply engaging in their hedonistic own pursuit. We're having huge fights about political ideas because those ideas really, really motivate.
Um, I mean, I think the book is diagnostic in addition to being normative, and so I would argue that the section on Americanism I would hope appeared to be more diagnostic than normative in the sense that, and we can get into this like personally, as you maybe can guess, but I'm not my identity is not wrapped up in strong commitments about what the meaning of America is. And so, but what I wanted to narrate in the book was that I think certainly for a large segment of my generational cohort, but not only, the idea of America having been born with an original sin that it can't ever be repented for is pretty common. The 1619 Project and its popularity, I think, brought into the American mainstream a very deep pessimism about the possibility of progress in American life that is, I think, widely held. Ta-Nehisi Coates' work, he is in some ways an Afro pessimist, and his pessimism is quite popular among, say, the American literate class. And so, and those include a lot of Jews among them. And so I think that the faith in America and it's this quality that you're just, the hopes that it embodied, I think those faiths have become quite attenuated, certainly compared to where they were at their high point, say at mid-century. I mean, I also, again, but now this is more normative than diagnostic, would dispute your read of American culture. I really don't see very much communitarianism in the mainstream of American life. I don't know where I would find it or what cultural outlet it might be expressed in. To me, you know, American life is really been like seems to be a rather cutthroat, brutal economic system where people are regularly denied their the basic things they need to live. so it's hard for me to understand where the where the optimism or where the investment of faith in, say, America's goodness is. Like, America also is a normal country, just like any other, and um, its political potential is contingent on what people do. It's not there. I mean, obviously, the weight of institutions and history bears on the present, but um, I don't see what about uh, the American creed would make one think that there are ingredients necessarily for the kind of hope that you're talking about.
Right. I think your temperament and mine are also coming out in analysis. You quote as mainstream people who I think of as fairly marginal, who have been pretty widely rebutted. If you count the people who voted for Harris and the people who voted for Trump, most of whom would not at all agree with the diagnosis, it's a pretty resounding consensus on a belief that there's not a problem this country can't resolve, and many of them we have. But I want to move on because I want to make time for your what do we do? So moving forward, because your book isn't just an analysis, and I also want to point out, just in case it's not clear, I have great respect for much of the analysis, even the parts I don't agree with, offer things that are worth reading and worth chewing on. So I want to encourage anyone who's listening, go get this book. Even the parts that will aggravate you will make you better. So it's an important conversation starter, but I want to give you time for now. Where do we go? For what ought we to do?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't. The book does not end with any strong prescriptive suggestions for everybody. I mean, the book ends with a sketch of four different paths that I see American Judaism taking. One has to do with the kind of survival of the legacy institutions into the future, but with a kind of decreasing popular buy-in to them. I mean, I think, like I said, like the the denominations that structured American Jewish life are not going anywhere, even if people don't identify with them as much. And they have endowments and they're strong institutions. They have strategic plans that will outlive basically everybody. So they could, if you want to live within that way of that kind of Judaism, I think that will be on offer for people. Another option for that I see being opted into by some people is what I call prophetic protest. This is the kind of Judaism that is being practiced by often, but not only, young people who bring Jewish language, signage, aesthetic into the streets to protest, whether it's for immigrants' rights or economic justice, or also against Israel's war in Gaza. I have a strong critique of the lack of substantive religious thought in this tendency, and I think that prophetic protest doesn't have an answer for what happens when the protest ends. What do they do with religion then? And then the third option is something that I call neo-reform, which makes the opposite move that prophetic protest does. So if prophetic protest takes Judaism and puts it into the street, neo-reform, and it's not the reform movement, takes politics and brings it into the synagogue. And it's kind of, I think this is probably widespread more than I realized as I've been going on my tour, of American Jews who want, their religious practice to match perfectly the political commitments that they have outside in the world. And that applies across the range of issues. I mean, the book deals head on with the, really important strides in LGBTQ inclusion that the liberal denominations have made over the last 20 years. But I think it's true around issues of race and issues of gender and sexual, like this is, and this tendency in American Jewish life, I think, is well poised also um, to bring in a lot of Jews who say come from interfaith families, because that's increasingly the majority of American Jews, actually. Um, and then the fourth option that I see being available for people is something that I call separatist orthodoxy. It's not only Haredi or ultra Orthodox Judaism, but also people who understand their Jewish practice to require a distance from mainstream American culture, both its consumerism, but also its liberalism. I think that that is a real force in American Jewish life, more so than before. I think we all see and feel the way that as as more American Jews opt out of communal activity, politics, organizational life, the place of orthodoxy in American Jewish life is growing. It's not only demographics. I mean, for me, I don't fit into any of these categories, which is something I write in the book easily, and I passed through them all in some ways. Grew up in institutional, passed through prophetic protest, have Orthodox family, and so I feel comfortable and uncomfortable in different parts of them. I mean, for me, my in process of writing the book led me back to traditional observance and keeping Shabbat halachically and a much, I think, um, deeper engagement with communal practice than I had had as a younger adult. Even if I grew up in a day school where we prayed, daven shachrit every morning. And so there was the book is in the end is a little bit about the book is about in some sense leaving, but also about returning in that way. I mean, if I had any if there is any like call to action that the book has, I mean, it would be twofold. One is that I think that American Jews, at least as I experienced American Jewish life, um, have avoided hard questions about what Judaism requires of them and have tried to find ways out of confronting the places where Jewish ritual or Jewish commitment puts them at odds with American society and the American mainstream. I think this has been a loss in general for American Jewish life because the distinctiveness of Jewish communal life has been eroded, I think, over the years of that these questions have been put off. So that would be one thing. And then the other call, I think, is that um, the book. I'll take one step back and say the book angered a lot of people about its Israel politics on both sides of the political map. It obviously angered people who can't accept that Israel is a flawed country and does bad things because the book has a lot to say about the bad things that Israel does. But it also bothered people who want to dissociate Jewish life entirely from Israel. And the call to action on Israel that I have is I think is basically one of responsibility. I think that as Jews, I'm a believer in Klal Yisrael in the broader Jewish collectivity, and I feel implicated and responsible for the things that other Jews do in the world, and that includes what Jews in Israel do. But I don't think that means we have to accept what they do as okay. And I think that there is maybe even a silent majority of American Jews who feel ashamed by the current Israeli government and by the conduct of Israel's war, and for whom there is no official acceptable place in communal life that can say that outright. And so I would encourage people who feel that way. I mean, it sounds contradictory what I'm calling for, but and maybe it is in the end, and I'll lose in this argument. But I think that there are two moves necessary at once. One is to invest more in communal life, but also accepting a much higher threshold of argument and disagreement within the bounds of that communal life. So I guess that's kind of where the book ends.
Gosh, I want to I just want to be clear. You obviously have a great love and loyalty to this amorphous enterprise of Jewish becoming and to Jewish peoplehood. There was no doubt of that at any point in your book. And I just want to affirm that here too. I agree with you that a big problem in contemporary Jewish life, I don't think this is just American Jewish life. I think Israel does this too. If there's only one legitimate way to love Israel, then by definition, you're going to create people who think they're anti-Israel because the pro-Israel people look at them and say, you're the enemy. There has to be multiple ways of identifying in the same way that in the United States, different people identify with different clusters of values, um, and have strong disagreements with each other. But there are many of us who believe that constructive criticism is at the end an act of loyalty and patriotism, and feel that abroad too. So to the extent that I can offer you any consolation, it's that everyone is feeling lonely, put upon, and misunderstood, no matter where they find themselves on any spectrum these days. So join the club. The last question I wanted to ask you, though, gets back to what you said, um, because it feels to me like the majority in Israel has also taken a right-wing turn. Um, and here I want to say that even though I often don't agree with it, I understand much of the motivation of it. You know, people who have experienced the rabid anti-Semitism of Muslim countries that expelled them and their parents, and the ongoing concern that what many Palestinian advocates want is not a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. They want the elimination of the Jewish state. And so people are legitimately terrified and resistant to that, I think. But I want to know, what do you do in your new home when you find many of the same institutional structures and you find yourself quoting marginal thinkers and some amorphous young people are going to all rise up, um, when, Bibi has no problem getting lots of young people to his rallies. So how do you keep yourself going? And I'm saying that because I love much of your vision. I don't want you to despair, but I could use a little strengthening here. How do you navigate that? Because I guess to this American rabbi, that doesn't sound like just an American issue. It sounds like an issue everywhere.
Right. It's a global issue. I mean, I want to be clear. Like, I don't think in the book that young people are going to rise up and change things. Like, that is not, nothing about the last decade and a half of political life suggests that that's going to happen. Um, I mean, I often say that um, I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic in the sense that I think you have to have hope that things will change. But I don't, there's no rational reason to think why it might be. I mean, I think that as a person who spends a lot of time trying to say translate the progressive camp in Israel into English for a wider audience, but also who is involved in some sense here in what's happening, I think that um, and in general, progressives have not done a great job at being able to say something like, I understand this fear, and the way that it would be better addressed is by doing something different than what the right is offering. Usually, progressives respond by saying that fear is illegitimate, or it's racist, or it's not true. And I mean, I think this, in this, I'll give an example of this where this I feel is like a particularly grave failure to me in the Israeli context, which is that um, as I understand it, the what happened in the wake of October 7th, there should have been a political opportunity of sorts, in the sense that people who believe that for Israelis to be safe, there has to be a diplomatic resolution to this conflict, could have said, see, you can't maintain a military control over millions of people and expect that you will be able to live in peace. So at the bare minimum, what this should teach us is that for Israeli Jewish security, there needs to be some kind of broader resolution, um, a political resolution to the conflict with the Palestinians, and ideally regional integration in order to normalize Israel's presence in the Middle East. Instead, what happened is that not enough people made that argument, and in its place, the right came in and said, actually, the problem with what the thing we learned from October 7th is that we should have never left Gaza. And actually, the problem isn't that there that isn't the occupation, so they're not enough occupation. And not only is and now the right is even, the right has gotten much more ambitious over the last year, because what began with a horrific tragedy has ended with a certain degree of Israeli military triumph. So you hear in Israeli discourse all the time, maybe Israeli troops will stay in the Syrian buffer zone and in Syria for indefinitely, and maybe there needs to be a buffer zone in Lebanon indefinitely. And all of a sudden, a country that on October 6th had mostly settled borders now has no border that's within it's confined within the armistice lines that were internationally recognized. And that's not the fault of progressives or liberals at all. That's the fault of a right-wing government that's has a large segment of extremists and territorial maximalists in it. But it also but it is also true that progressives haven't been able to make the case that increasing military conflict is not going to bring about a more safe more greater safety for Israelis. So that's just one example of, I think, the challenge that we face. I mean, in some sense, I think that, and this is, in the American context, I think this is true on a different set of issues, but that liberals and progressives stopped trying to make arguments and persuade and actually address the root causes of things, and wrote off people who believed things that were different from them. And in some sense, I don't think that's also not the reason why Trump won, but it's certainly part of what happened in the United States. That that progressive-minded people in this way weren't able to take seriously the concerns of their fellow citizens, and wrote them off to their own, to their own detriment.
We're going to have to close. I could keep talking forever. Unfortunately for you, I'm not allowed to. Um, I do want to invite all of our listeners to express deep gratitude to you, Joshua, for having raised these really important questions and for offering an impassioned person's analysis and thought. You've mobilized a tremendous amount of data. You put it together in a very compelling story. And in that regard, you've done us all a great service. So thank you for the book. Thank you for your continued voice out in the world. And thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great honor to talk with you, and to talk to this audience. And it means a lot. I'm very grateful for it.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you'll come back really soon to listen to more of AJU's open learning programs, all of which you'll